Living in the covert world, it's probably the most difficult thing I did. It's difficult physically and most certainly emotionally. Once you enter that world, everything gets a little bit foggy at times. The longer I was in it, the foggier it got.
Believe me, mate, this is good. I'm on 60 mils a day. I can't take too much more.
Oh, shit, no, that's cool. Oh, fuck, here they come. One of the problems was that I was being 3 or 4 different people. I'd be Lenny Rogers or Philip Appleby or Dean Colley or whoever. They'd often come from slightly different classes of life and had different backgrounds. The real difficulty was slipping in and out of those things, of those people. And at times I wasn't able to. But it wasn't until later in my career that I realised that all these people were actually me. It wasn't until then that I think I became the best undercover I could be, because there was no acting required. I was being me. I used to come home from being Lenny Rogers or Dean, and I recall at the time my partner wouldn't allow me to come in the house until I'd taken all my clothes off. I'd have a shower and just wash Lenny off. And I found it was so much easier for me to step back into my world. And then my real problem started when I stumbled across the fact that someone in my drug squad had sold out my job. And at that time I was working on a group of criminals making speed. We identified the main man to be Peter Pillarinos. He was the money man. From inside the drug squad, it was very difficult to work on a fellow officer. I was reluctant to a point, and that point was when I took it personally, and I decided to attack back.
My real name is Lachlan McCulloch. I'd like to take you on a journey. It's my journey. And at the end of it, I hope you'll understand why I joined the force and why I left it. I had a meeting with my boss, John McCoy, and he asked me to look at the ethical, there's this document on his wall that stated the Victoria Police ethics. He said, where in that does it say, thou shalt not investigate a fellow officer? I said, it doesn't. He said, exactly, just do it. So I did it.
"5 months after I graduated from the police academy, I was sent to the Richmond police station. A couple of days after arriving there, an incident happened that was to stay with me for the rest of my career. It was right here, right where that black car's parked, that I was working on a Sunday afternoon with my partner driving a divisional van, and we decided to check an old grey panel van with 2 heads on board, as we say. I jumped out and looked through the driver's side window and found the male driver leaning over, injecting the female passenger right in the base of the eye. The passenger was a 15-year-old girl. I'd never seen anything like that, and my initial reaction was I wanted to kill him. She immediately became unconscious. I waited for him to pull the syringe out of her eye and reached through the driver's window, grabbed him by the hair and removed him from the vehicle. What made it worse was my partner, a few seconds later, unhandcuffed him and let him go. I immediately said to him, why? Why have you just let him go?
He said, "Look at your watch, mate, we've got 10 minutes to go to the end of the shift." That absolutely devastated me. I left work and went home, and I recall talking to my girlfriend at the time and saying that I didn't want to see her anymore. I didn't love anything, I was just in limbo.
Later I transferred to St Kilda, and it was sensational because I was surrounded by other cops just as keen as me.
They wanted to catch crooks. There was no knocking off on time. It was starting early and finishing late.
But in a fairly close-knit office, he was always the outsider. He was always a bit of a loner. His colleagues remember that he was not the sort that really liked the mediocre crimes. He wasn't too keen on arresting drunks. He was always looking for a big pinch.
In the drug squad and during the investigation into the police corruption, I had cause to see a psych. It was just after I was involved in a police shooting. My partner shot dead Arthur James Nelson, an escapee from Canberra prison. I jumped off a rooftop into the backyard and proceeded down the sideway. All of a sudden, Nelson jumped out and tried to stab myself and my partner. I started to pull the trigger and my partner pulled first.
I just thought it was a gun. I thought I was dead. I had my gun out and all I wanted to do was stop him. I pulled the trigger. I didn't know whether I was going to hit him or not.
The gunpowder hit me fair square in the side of the face like a handful of gravel. It wiped out my senses, wiped out my ears, and all of a sudden I had Nelson fall on top of me and down on the ground. At this stage, I still believed it was a firearm and was immediately concerned with this offender here. It turned out Nelson had cut his way out of a remand centre in Canberra and had just been arrested for 6 armed robberies. He was about to go in jail, and there were people in jail that wanted to kill him for being an informer. He had tattoos of spiderwebs across his face, and he had "get fucked" across his chest. He was a nasty piece of work. And in our terms, we referred to people like him as scumbags. Every time I closed my eyes, I just got sucked into a whirlpool. I couldn't stop it. It's hard to describe how incredibly angry I'd been after the shooting, and that was angry at Nelson himself. I mean, Nelson put us in the position to shoot him, and I bleed every time I hear a policeman's shot someone.
And he started to work on his own, and he started to realise that he had a bit of an ability as an undercover. And even though he hadn't been taught how to do it, he started to wear scruffy clothes and really blend in with the flotsam and jetsam of St Kilda. And Lachlan himself is a pretty clean-cut fella, and when you look at him you wouldn't think that that would be a role that would suit. But he found he was a very good mimic. That's the interesting thing about Lachlan. He's a fellow with about 1,000 faces. I sometimes look at him and I just can't believe that he ever was a policeman. He doesn't look like one. And then sometimes I look at him and I can't believe he's anything but a policeman, because he looks exactly like one. And he's able to fit into these different roles. But he was always a bit of a loner in that regard.
At the drug squad, when I was there was only 3 of us that actually worked undercover. There were 86 odd members, and there were 3 of us that were trained, that were allowed to work and penetrate criminal syndicates. There was a thing called undercover syndrome. People like me falling into the world of undercover. I mean, about half an hour before I did a job, I would suddenly start becoming the real Lenny Rogers. To walk in to a situation where you're surrounded or you meet with several serious crooks, to pull the job off, meaning to actually pass as someone that you are absolutely not. To give them many thousands of dollars, and at times tens of thousands of dollars, to purchase a large amount of drugs, and to walk away with the drugs and tape recordings, etc. I can't describe the intense elation and feeling. One time, just before I had a very large meeting where I was going to meet with several crooks and purchase in excess of $50,000 worth of heroin, and I was giving the crooks the money and going to walk away, and I decided at the last minute to pull over and check the money. I was with another female person involved in the investigation, and I stopped for some unknown reason. I was already running late for the meeting. I stopped and started to count the money, and just to check it was correct. And as I started counting, I nearly died when I found a post-it note, a yellow stick-on post-it note in amongst the money that said the words, Operation Tremor, $52,000. So you can imagine me handing that to the crooks and them finding that note. So, the longer you do it, the more you realise, am I getting closer to dying? Am I getting closer to being found out? I used to think I was pretty good, but getting toward the end, it wore pretty thin. Fishing is my other passion. It gets me outdoors and just helps me keep sane. I've fished every available opportunity. One thing I did find over the years was that fishing is very similar to catching crooks. In that I mean using the right bait and being in the right areas in the hot spots. But one thing I did find is that the fish often smelt a hell of a lot better than the crooks.
He's no goody two-shoes. When he joined the police force, he learnt very quickly that sometimes you have to bend rules to catch a crook. So he was no white knight, and he certainly didn't turn his nose up when he saw other police doing things which the cliche is noble cause corruption, which is doing things using a means to an end. But that was about catching crooks, not about letting them go. And that's where he drew the line.
I suppose I was an obsessive-compulsive character undercover, and that flowed through to my investigative duties. So when I came across corruption in the drug squad, I attacked that with as much vigour and enthusiasm as I did my covert work.
I found a message on my desk. It said, "Ring Len Dogger, Crown Scientific." I did. I spoke to Len, and Len, who was just a storeman working behind a counter, said that he just had a visitor for about the 20th time, a person by the name of James. James was purchasing chemicals that he believed were suspicious.
James was a retired chemist who had knowledge of the manufacture of amphetamines. We needed someone that could convert chemicals into amphetamines and decipher a recipe that I'd obtained.
I asked him, how much has this guy bought? He said, well, he could open his own university. He'd spent thousands upon thousands of dollars on glassware and chemicals.
Amphetamine's one of the only drug that you can actually cut to 5% and people will still buy it. At that level, you're looking at $1 million a kilogram for the stuff.
I came back, and that was my first operation in the drug squad. I was very proud of that operation, and I worked it for the next 6.5 months. During that job, things were going brilliantly.
I met a man by the name of Peter Pillarinos. He was a neighbour of mine, and how we met was I had a Harley-Davidson motorcycle and so did he. He introduced himself and we struck up a type of friendship that evolved into a business in the manufacture of amphetamines. Through Peter Pillarinos, I met a man by the name of Kevin Hicks, who was a drug squad detective.
Kevin Hicks was no star, never was going to be one. It was a bit of a surprise when he ended up at the Major Crime Squad in the first place. Brave enough when he was led by others, but ultimately got more involved in the drinking than the arresting. And the Major Crime Squad ultimately was out of control. He got the flick and he went to the drug squad, but he wasn't trusted to do anything there other than to be virtually a clerk. And part of that job was to look after seized items, including drugs.
Kevin Hicks supplied the keys to go to Atwood, which is the police storage facility where they store the remains of raids that they've done on sets of crooks cooking up amphetamines, and we could take what we wanted.
Well, if I had to describe it, I'd say we were given the keys to the lolly shop. That's what it was. That's what it was like.
On the first visit we went there was actually finished product in a box. I said to Peter, "What do we bother at taking chemicals to make this stuff when the finished stuff's there?" Peter said, "We're only to take what we've been told by Kevin to take."
I immediately did what we called a B2 request to Canberra to ask who owned the house. The house was owned by Peter Pillarinos and his family. I did a tax check in Canberra to find out what he claimed to do for a job. He was in excess of 40 and he had never filed a tax return in his life. But he did have 5 pages of prior convictions. His last arrest was 12 years earlier. And the people who I found significant now, the people who arrested him 12 years earlier, were the Major Crime Squad. Since then, he'd never been touched.
After about 3 attempts, I'd actually got the process to work, and we actually got a decent product out, which a few people tried and confirmed that it was what it was supposed to be.
Kevin Hicks had told us on one of the meetings that we may have been under surveillance and the police were setting up a camera outside Peter's place.
We basically moved the lab across the road to Grant's place.
I immediately worked on Peter. Peter was talking openly on the phone, so were all the criminals.
With Kevin Hicks's help, Grant managed to get hold of some ketone, and from that we actually produced a fair amount of pretty good quality speed. What people have got to realise is that I could have made 10 times the amount of amphetamine that I did, but the reason I didn't was because I thought that if we'd made a whole heap of money for them quickly, they would just kill us because of what we knew at Atwood.
The phones were being monitored and the operation was going well until a phone call came from Ken. Ken was a serious old crook. He said to James, "I'm going to meet with the bloke and find out if this phone's off." Then an hour later, Ken rang James again. This time in a serious voice. He said, "Guard your rear visions like guardian angels. Treat this thing like everybody's listening." I realised then that those calls signalled the end of Operation Cain. I listened to them again and again, and the worst part was that Ken used the word off. That wasn't one of his words, it was one of ours.
So we decided to close up shop. In the meantime, there was an article in the Hearld-Sun that police had discovered some of the chemicals were missing from the facility.
I immediately contacted my bosses and they called a meeting.
My bosses said, "Lachlan, you haven't had leave this year. You're owed 3 months. See you later. I didn't want to, but I did. I had to. I left.
Although Peter and Kevin were partners, it was pretty obvious that they weren't trusting each other that much. Several times Kevin would ask me how things were going. And when Peter said he had no money, Kevin had questioned me. When Peter left the room, he'd ask me things like, "What's happening? How's James going? Do I feel safe?"
Pillarinos and Grant picked me up from my place and took me back to Grant's place in the car, and I had this really bad premonition that something bad was going to happen. When we got there, Pillarinos had taken out a rifle and was threatening to blow me away with it or blow my head off. And he was accusing me of actually going into business for myself, going back out to Atwood on my own to steal chemicals and or drugs.
And he actually had hold of a knife and he had it to James's fingers and actually drew blood. And this was after he had actually punched him several times and caused James to be in a real frightened state.
I decided to get rid of Peter permanently, and it took me about a week to come up with a plan. I was more upset about Peter actually threatening members of my family rather than just me.
So I grabbed hold of a gun and pretended to go crazy and waved the gun around and said I was taking care of business here. Peter left the room.
I'd got some sodium cyanide and laced it with a bit of speed. It was actually about a 50-50 mix. And the plan was I was going to get him to take it, and hopefully that would kill him, but certainly if it didn't kill him, it'd certainly get his attention. So in the end, I couldn't go through with it.
Sometime later, I drifted back into undercover operations. One thing's often said is that only cops know what cops go through. And it can be said the same thing as with undercover cops. Only an undercover cop knows what an undercover cop goes through. The good part of the Brotherhood is that it gives every police officer the ability to go into dangerous situations and know that their brothers are behind them, that they will be protected. To some extent, it gives you the ability to know that you'll be avenged.
3 years later, I was chosen to go to the undercover unit to be full-time for a considerable period of time. And I said, yeah, no worries. So I was in the middle of doing that and leaving the drug squad when my boss walked up to me and said, would you like to be upgraded to Detective Sergeant for the next 12 months? Which meant an increase in pay. And I said, oh, you know, I'm pretty right. He said, you've got 4 detectives and 2 senior constables full-time. And I said, can I do what I'd like to do? And he said, yeah, if you've got someone you want to work on, just give me a target profile. Within 2 days, I did a target profile. Over the previous 3 years, I had monitored the movements of Peter Pillarinos overseas and within Australia, and his associates. I'd done regular checks on their home addresses. I knew everything about them. I'd had him searched at the airport. I'd had all his documents photocopied. It was top secret. So I called in my boss, who owned a racehorse with him, who I trusted and knew for a long time. I told him what I'd just discovered and played the telephone tapes to him, and he cried. He then did something that affected him for a very long time. And never guess what that was. He had been both Steve and Kevin's boss at the Major Crime Squad. He'd known them for years. That's how they bought the racehorse. Have a guess what he did not do. He did not pick up the phone and warn them. So he suffered a similar vilification that I suffered. So for 2 weeks he did not pick up that phone and he did not warn his close friends.
So basically, in essence, what Lachlan was doing was turning in a fellow police officer in that investigation, and that was a huge source of stress for Lachlan to do that. And it also meant that he felt very isolated from his colleagues as well, because a lot of them obviously didn't understand what he was doing.
There came a time when I realised I did have a bit of a problem. I found out that my father had called a family meeting, and that meeting didn't involve me, but it was about me. And the family was speaking about my behaviour and how I'd changed and what could they do about it. And I realised it was time. It was time to at least tell my father what I was doing. I took him fishing and had a few drinks and explained that I was doing probably the most important thing in my life. And I told him that I'd be safe and the people around me would be safe, but I had to do it. And he offered me all the encouragement in the world. And he said, if you're going to do it properly.
From the time that he was old enough to fish or do anything, whatever he did wholeheartedly. He never did anything that he wasn't determined to do properly. And I think that that is gone right through life as far as he's concerned. He's been that way inclined.
And he's the one that taught me everything about being a person. I think of trying to be a good person.
And from the smiley, cheeky grin and the sparkly eyes, that all disappeared. And he'd come round one day, and as I saw him out the door, I said, "Please, Dale, can't you just let it go? Can't you just walk away?" And he said, "Mum, I joined the force to catch the baddies, and I'm going to catch the baddies." And that's the only time I cried.
Now, if you look the other way, walk the other way, ignore it, etc., then corruption doesn't exist. It only exists if there is someone willing to bring it out and expose it. Otherwise, it basically lives forever hidden.
McCulloch wanted Pillarinos. He didn't want Hicks. He didn't want to catch a corrupt copper. He wanted to catch his target. But in catching or getting so close to Pillarinos, the overwhelming evidence was of corruption. So when that came forward, he's caught because ultimately he becomes the informer in the case. And when police do an investigation, informers get hurt in the end because you want to catch the person at the end of it, the criminal. McCulloch was in a situation where he could get bruised, damaged, or even destroyed because they had to go after Hicks. Looking after McCulloch became a secondary matter.
I walked through the door and I'm turning left. And from my right, I hear, "Aha! It's the dog. The dog's come to work. The filthy maggot." And everyone's turned. And I turned and walked up to him. I said, "What are you talking about? What on earth? What's that about?" He goes, "We know, mate, we know." I said, "What do you know?" "Oh, we know about Kevin. We know what's going on."
I questioned him further and said, "Well, who told you?" And he said, "Well, the boss briefed us all." And so I walked down the hall and spoke to the boss and said, "I've just been called a maggot." And he was most upset and went on to explain things that I didn't know. He said, "Lachlan, Kevin Hicks has been ringing our drug squad intelligence section and asking questions about your operation." And I realised he, in a way, had to tell people not to talk to Kevin Hicks. And to me, it had totally and utterly blown my operation out of the water. That the 86 members of the drug squad knew all about and all aspects of my operation.
Police have a very interesting culture, double-edged sword. They're always prepared to judge a crook, but they learn very quickly how to ignore a policeman who's suspect. There are certain ways that you can deal with that. You don't leave files open, you don't talk to somebody about a job if you think they may be a leak or a traitor. You don't invite them on your early raids. You try and isolate them from confidential information. But Lachlan was too naive. Lachlan didn't believe that there was any police who would ever betray him.
4 days after the whole drug squad had been briefed about my operation, I got to work and found the door to my secret office within the drug squad had been jemmied open. I looked inside and all my files had been left out and tipped upside down and all over the place. The only people that knew where my office was within the drug squad were drug squad personnel. The only people that could get into the building were police, and into the drug squad were drug squad members. Whoever did that burglary made a big mistake because they had made everything personal.
At work, he was very concerned and distressed because he said there had been some threats made by fellow police officers to him, some direct threats.
As soon as it became clear that 2 detectives were conducting criminal activities in our operation, people around me didn't want to play.
One colleague said, "If we continue with this, mate, we'll be glassed in the face at a pub."
Some members left the squad and others just turned away. They're still in the job now. There was an internal investigation. Kevin Hicks was charged with making a false diary entry. After investigating Detective Senior Constable Kevin Hicks for so long, I realised there was only one way forward, and that was flat out. Once I started working in the Ethical Standards Task Force against Kevin Hicks and Peter Pillarinos, threats started to increase in number and severity. They were threatening my life and property. Bosses were pulling me aside and informing me that I should be carrying a gun because they were serious threats, mainly coming from Peter Pillarinos. I was not a toe cutter or the filth, as some people describe internal investigators. I was just a senior detective trying to catch a crook. A lot of even close friends found it very difficult to understand why I would take such a quantum leap backwards. I was asked, when did I realise that I was going to leave the police force? And I immediately knew the answer. And unfortunately, it was the moment I chose to become an internal investigator. After the death threats, the Victoria Police sent a person round from the anti-terrorist section. He walked into my home and immediately started to treat my home as if it was in another country He explained that he had to put bulletproof glass on all the windows, have a form-up point at one section of the house, a safety room. I suddenly realised that this was serious shit.
He didn't have a sanctuary or anywhere to go to where he felt removed or safe from these pressures. I remember him telling me at the time that he was being set up, I think it was for the murder of 2 Asian drug couriers that had occurred in Melbourne, and there's some allegations made that he'd been involved in that murder. And it was clearly a setup, but that was yet another pressure that he had to deal with.
They'd been executed. They'd been handcuffed behind their back and bent down and shot in the back of the head. I looked at the article on the front page of this national paper, and it said that they were executed because they were informers for a member of the drug squad. At the time, I was at the Ethical Standards Department task force investigating Kevin Hicks. I couldn't believe it and wondered who the hell could this drug squad person be. So I made some inquiries. I found out it was me. It's easy to work on a crook, but of course, he was a fellow member of the police force. He was part of the Brotherhood. He was fully supported by many, many officers. And it got to a point where I went diving at nearly midnight. I found myself doing things that weren't me. I could not any longer police at the level I was accustomed. I was not the full 100%, although I loved the job. I mean, I was investigating someone who carries a gun for a living. I mean, we shoot people.
A lot of police get prematurely cynical, or they'd like to say they're realists. So they don't get really broken-hearted when they get let down, either outside of the job or within it. Lachlan's always worn his heart on the sleeve, and he's an idealist. So when he was betrayed from within, it was like stabbing him in the heart.
Why did I do it? That's a bloody good question. And to this day, I don't really know. All I do know is I was betrayed. I was betrayed by a colleague and a friend. And in the world of policing, you can do a lot of shit, but you don't sell out a job. When I was under attack by certain police, criminals, reporters, etc., I had cause to have a meeting with some senior officers. During the meeting, I was fully supported. They patted me on the back and offered me all the support in the world to continue what I was doing. I walked out of that meeting, and as I walked away, I spoke to another police officer and said how rapt I was that I was finally being supported. He stopped and turned and looked at me and said, "No, you aren't, mate. They just want you to shut the fuck up."
The technical term is diminished resolve. They start going after the corruption, then they start thinking of the publicity, the headlines, the answers, and some of these investigations lose their sting as they go along. But when you've got a person obsessed like Lachlan, it's not going to go away. Because what? He might go public. There might be a royal commission. Do you want to be the senior officer to ask the questions why you didn't take McCulloch seriously?
These attacks and threats were specifically designed to attack my credibility. They were part of an orchestrated smear campaign designed to stop me being effective at any future trial. I was the only witness that could put all of these years together. The burglary on my office was obviously committed by a fellow detective. Whoever did it went directly to Peter Pillarinos and told him that his phones were being monitored. Then, during conversations between Peter and other criminals, Peter would directly threaten me. He would, during the conversations, say that there's a person sitting in an office listening to these phone calls and he thinks I'm a target. Don't ever think I'm a target. And he went right off on the phones and swearing and totally abusing me. And you could see that a lot of the phone calls were purely designed to threaten me. So what we did was we started arresting everybody. No, it's all right. Can you offer any explanation why you possess these?
There is no gun that goes with those things. No gun goes with them.
Do you know anything about this weapon? I'm just going to have to check if it's safe. We have what appears to be a laser scope attached to it. Do you know anything about this weapon?
Yeah, I do.
When they raided Peter Pillarinos' place, they found a gun there, what they believed to be a .44 Magnum. I remember where he got that gun from. I went with him to behind Russell Street Police Station in the city one night, and he was given the gun by Kevin Hicks. I remember going back. I remember Peter trying to fit .44 Magnum shells in it. It wouldn't fit. It's when I thought, I'll pull out one of my shells. I pulled out a .44-40. Fit it beautifully. I then realised that the gun was stolen. Stolen from another raid. A raid on a friend of mine's place. He lost that gun. That gun was stolen. Kevin Hicks attended that raid.
I've already cautioned you several times. Is it loaded?
Yeah.
Any reason for it to be loaded?
Well, that's the way it was left there, so.
What can you tell me about the gun?
It belongs to someone else.
.44 calibre rounds, 2 of them. How do you know how to operate this weapon, Peter?
Well, I've used it before.
It was those phone calls when I actually heard Peter threatening me that made it personal, I suppose, on both levels. Peter and I were at that stage, I suppose, at war. When the criminals realised that all these attacks on me had actually worked and had me kicked off the task force, and my future in the Victoria Police Force was being directly affected, they swung on to my fellow investigators. Now, the investigators that worked with me on Guardsmen suddenly became targets themselves. They were the subject of very serious allegations, obviously orchestrated by members within the force and ex-members that had worked with these investigators in years gone by. A while later, the telephones identified a remote farmhouse hidden away in the country. It was a speed lab. We'd put a listening device in it and we listened to a couple of the crooks making speed. We arrested them and found a massive amount of chemicals and glassware. Sometime later, a witness made a statement saying that much of that glassware and chemicals belonged to Peter Pillarinos.
When James and I were arrested, we were both taken to the drug squad headquarters, taken separately. I knew nothing of what James had said. I knew nothing about what was to come.
The information that I had, I thought was very damaging, and that I couldn't trust just anyone with this sort of information, because I thought if I told the wrong copper, I'd end up dead. But it was something that Lachlan McCulloch said in the course of the interview which finally made me realise that I could actually trust him. I told him about Kevin Hicks's and Peter Pillarinos and my role in the Atwood break-ins, and he was stunned.
I was investigating a laboratory being supplied by my drug squad. because Kevin Hicks was the property officer at the time.
You can imagine how I felt when I'd been kicked out of police departments and accused of all these various crimes, and I end up at the rape squad. Finally, the day came when Kevin Hicks was arrested and charged. Rumours abound that there was no evidence at all, that the evidence was very, very weak, based on other criminals who couldn't be trusted, that had been offered deals and all this sort of stuff. And the moment he was charged, another detective from the Major Crime Squad, a detective sergeant, immediately put his own house up for security to allow Kevin Hicks bail. I didn't see it at first, but over the time I realised why they were so keen to support Kevin. At first I thought that he was a mate and that he was part of the Brotherhood, so to speak. But then I realised it was to protect their own asses, and that they were sending a massive, very serious signal to Kevin to say, we support you, mate, hold in there, don't give up, we'll be batting for you. In other words, don't talk out of school, don't make any deals with the prosecution, don't try and get a lesser sentence by giving evidence against other police. I got to the committal hearing and was on standby for weeks, and I was one of the last witnesses. The committal went for over a month. And of course, throughout this, Kevin Hicks was totally innocent, still being supported by my very own police association.
When Hicks finally pleaded guilty, there were lots of his old colleagues in court there to give him moral support. On the other side of the court, McCulloch sat with a couple of ethical standards police. There were no old mates there to pat Lachlan on the back.
And it got to a stage where I didn't know if I was going to walk out the front door and be filmed or shot. That's real. So anyway, thank you for listening.
Today, the conspirators were reunited in the dock. Hicks sentenced to 7.5 years jail, Pillarinos to 8.5 years. Looking on was the former detective who first raised the alarm on Hicks, no longer in the force after 8 years of frustration in getting the case to court.
Task Force guardsman solved the problem, and now it's all over and I can get on with my life.
Kevin wasn't found guilty. He walked in and said, I'm guilty of corruption. And to me personally, there's a huge difference. No one can look back on what I did and say he didn't do it.
Investigate the corrupt activities of a member of the Victoria Police Force and others resulting in their successful prosecution for serious criminal offences. Former Detective Senior Constable McCulloch.
I just hope that one day corrupt cops won't just fear the odd whistleblower, the odd person that might stand up against them, that they will fear every single officer. And when that day comes, I think the Brotherhood, in its bad sense, will be turned around, and that they will not be protected by cops that look away.